admissions now in the war in Ukraine. First from the Ukrainian side, and also from reports of captured Ukrainian soldiers high on some kind of drugs that are, I guess, propelling them on the front lines to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, according to reports. But we're also getting now reports from the Ukrainian side, unbelievable admission about where this war is going from a member of Ukrainian's own parliament. Now, this interview was featured on Sky News. Sky News has now deleted this interview. Was it something she said? Listen.
It's the latest situation. The counteroffensive is going as planned. Is it going as planned? Well, as much as we can have it going as planned with the amount of weapons and the quality of the ammunition that we're getting. The steadier the deliveries and the bigger the deliveries of the armaments for Ukraine, the faster the counteroffensive can go. That's the problem. You've regained, what, less than 1% of the ground that you lost before the invasion? Unfortunately, that is. And you only have like another month to go before? Another month or so before the cold and the winter settles in, before we can, before we will have to actually pause until the springtime. And this is the sad news for us, and I think not just for us, but all the countries that are supporting Ukraine right now. Is that continuing? Because I get the impression, I'm certainly told, that there is, you're having to try harder and harder to get aid specifically from Europe and other Western countries. It is getting harder and harder because Russia is winning the battle of a protracted conflict today. So they are winning? In terms of protracted conflict strategies that they're trying to impose on Ukraine and the world, unfortunately, we have to say that they are gaining the upper hand yet again. They have done this back in 2014. The lessons weren't learned. The aid was being delivered too slowly and at a non-stable rate, and this is the results that we are getting. I am a firm believer that Russia could have been stopped with their escalation of the aggression in February 2022, when Ukraine was asking for weapons through January, through October, November, December 2021, but was not being taken seriously. And when the offer on the table for us Ukrainians was to surrender to Putin's demands.
So Ukraine is running out of time, they're running out of weapons, they're running out of personnel. And we wanted to bring in ex-CIA analyst Larry Johnson, who follows this all very closely, to dive into this. Larry, a couple of big things I want to cover with you today. But first, I just want to get your response to what this woman, Leslie, has said about the truth about what's happening in Ukraine right now. They're admitting Russia's winning.
Yeah, well, it's evident if anybody's just been paying attention. Look at social media. Social media is the one thing that no government in the world can completely, fully control. They can try to shut it down. So when you go to social media, you see row upon row upon row of Ukrainian flags fluttering over freshly dug graves. Thousands of these. You don't see that in Russia.
Right.
So right there, it tells you right away that the casualties are in Ukraine. The average age of the soldier fighting on the front lines for Ukraine is 40 years old. That means you may have one or two who are 17 or 18, but you got a lot more who are over the age of 40. That speaks to a manpower loss. Just put the losses in context. Right now, it's estimated that Ukraine has lost over 500,000 men killed in action.
Wow.
During World War II, the British, the United Kingdom, its entire killed in action in both Europe, Africa, and the Pacific was 345,000. That was after 6 years of war. So we need to understand that what's unfolding right now in Ukraine is unbelievable carnage.
And the winter approaching. She admits that only a few weeks left, of course, until the cold weather, the immobilization of these troops, and basically admitting whatever sort of counteroffensive they had, they haven't really gained anything at all. In fact, it's been maybe inches here and there, and over close to 100,000 killed now just in this counteroffensive.
Yeah. What people didn't understand is that the defensive lines that Surovikin erected a year ago, they were not designed like the Alamo, where you stand and fight and, Jim Bowie laying on his bed, throwing a Bowie knife as he's getting killed. Right. They are designed to be flexible. So when they come in, they bend, and then the Ukrainians go into what's called a salient, and then they get attacked from the side, and they're forced back out. So it's think of it more like a rubber band. But the truth of the matter is, and it was even reported by the New York Times, is that total land captured, Russia's captured far more than Ukraine. But this isn't about capturing land. It's about the question of, do you have a force that is trained, that you can sustain in the field, and that has a good logistics flow to it? And that's what's breaking down on the Ukrainian side. They're utterly dependent upon money from the West and weapons from the West. And in the last 2 or 3 days, we've had the British even admit, hey, we've run out. We don't have any more to send.
Right. This is a big revelation from the British side. We don't have any weapons to send, and frankly, we're out of money to send. And according to Ben Wallace, a former UK defense secretary, says Zelensky must start mobilizing young Ukrainians more. So now you've exhausted just about everything. Now let's start going into the youngest of the young and throwing them onto the front lines. And as you've been reporting on your Telegram and on your website, the countless number of young Ukrainian men in the funeral processions that you're not seeing in Western coverage. I mean, open caskets of Ukrainian soldiers, weeping mothers, weeping wives, people lining the streets as caskets are being brought down the Ukrainian streets, and you're not going to see that on CNN. Right.
Now, and it's what it's doing to the Ukrainian population. Look back again at World War II as a benchmark, as a reference point. The United States lost 472,000 killed in action in the Pacific and Europe and Africa. And we had a population then of about 160 million. Here's Ukraine, whose population right now in country is estimated to be around 25 million. And they've lost more people, more men than either the United States or Britain did during World War II. So this is approaching sort of, it's reminiscent more of the Chaco War back in Paraguay, where you lost an entire generation of men. And it's going to depopulate Ukraine. There will be nobody to have children. There will be no fathers.
What about, you've been covering this as well, and we wanted to talk about the drugs that are being used. Can you speak about this with these soldiers and the reports of this?
Well, this comes from a Russian correspondent. Goes by his name is Marat, and I was conversing with him yesterday, and he says, what kind of drugs could these guys be using? And he says, they're picking up these prisoners and they're just whacked out of their minds. And he says that they actually go through withdrawal. He says some of them, it takes up to a week. And he says, but the effect of the drug is it takes away any reservation about putting themselves at risk. Now, I know in the early days when Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 were first set up in the United States, there were drugs that were given to these soldiers either to help them go to sleep or to keep them awake. And so that's 40 years ago. So I am willing to guess in the last 40 years, there's been some medical research. In fact, there were a lot of DARPA labs there in Ukraine. And if they were doing medical research, biological research into drugs that you can give to people that will eliminate any inhibition about putting their lives at risk and turn them into sort of super soldiers, I think that's what we may be seeing here, because this was not a piece of propaganda. He wasn't trying to feed me a story. He was legitimately puzzled by it. He says, we've never seen anything like this.
It's unbelievable. So then after they're captured or after they're surrendering, I mean, do we even know if these are surrendered soldiers or captured? Because if they're on these drugs, the chances of them surrendering are probably, I don't know, maybe slim to none, but that's just my conjecture, Yeah,
these are captured. These are ones that are capturing on the front lines. And the situation has turned it's really so dire for the Ukrainians, because if you're wounded and you've been shot or you've got some fragments, if you can walk out or if you can move yourself, then you can probably get medical care. But there are reports that soldiers that have been wounded are having to pay bribes to get themselves taken back to a medical aid station on the Ukrainian side. So the morale on the Ukrainian side is just suffering some really significant setbacks.
Can you also talk about the soldiers and the reports that you've had? This has been fascinating to see the lack of armored personnel carriers, the lack of armored vehicles, and so forth. And now Ukrainian soldiers being forced to go on foot and or bicycle to attack the Russians. What do we know about that?
Yeah, there's one video that's popped up on social media, on Telegram. And this guy's got a bicycle with a bunch of landmines strapped to it, and he's moving them forward along a dirt road. The reality is the armored vehicles are a target, and Ukraine doesn't have any way to protect them. In a normal conventional army, if it was functioning properly, there would be some air cover, fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters. There would be some mobile artillery so that they could at least lay down a field of fire as these guys would move forward. Well, they don't have that. That's not happening. The Russians, on the other hand, have ample amounts of artillery ammunition. They've got the fixed-wing aircraft. They've got the helicopters. And so they're able to just devastate anybody in an armored vehicle or a tank. So they've come up, their solution is to try to infiltrate guys in on foot. I don't know if you've ever carried a box of ammunition, but a box of .308 ammunition weighs over 40 pounds.
Yeah, it's very
and you will shoot through that if you load that up in any kind of automatic weapon. You will go through that in a period of about 15 minutes. So just the amount of weight you have to carry, putting soldiers in this position, makes their combat ineffective. And you're forgetting about, what about the food? What about the water?
Right.
Water itself is heavy. Go fill up a couple of gallon jugs of water and walk around with those. Well, How much water do you think a guy on the front line needs? So these very practical considerations, the thing that touting, well, hey, they're walking in on foot, that's a great strategy. That's ridiculous.
Well, one of the things that famously U.S. Grant became president of the United States, General Ulysses S. Grant, during the Civil War, was famous for was making sure that everyone had provisions and everything was fully stocked.
Yeah.
And making sure the reinforcements were there, and all of the army will break down and collapse without the water, without the food, without the provisions, without the ammunition, without all of those things. It may seem, to other people's minds, secondary to the fighting, but in fact, it is the most important part of the fighting.
Yeah. In fact, go back to World War II. One of the signs of the collapse of Germany was you saw German soldiers in horse carts. So they were driving horses to pull artillery pieces. They didn't have the fuel to run the vehicles. So that's a sign of collapse. It's a sign of this thing is going to come to an end, and it may come to a very rapid end, just like what we saw in Afghanistan. Remember, we were promised that the Afghan army was going to fight on for years, and they were the best in the area, and then boom, overnight, they were gone in a week. So that I actually think that is a possibility here with respect to Ukraine.
What are your intelligence sources telling you as it relates to this back and forth right now? It sounds like we're seeing a couple of media reports. We've seen a couple of mainstream media reports that are showing some negativity towards Ukraine. Politico releasing that leaked State Department memo showing the corruption, the State Department admitting to the massive amount of corruption inside of Ukraine, and a couple of other odd-timed mainstream media pieces about Ukraine being corrupt, about them their offensive collapsing. And then, of course, we have this turnover in Congress right now with funding going into Ukraine, the British saying they have no more weapons. It all smells funny to me. But I'm not I'm not an ex-CIA analyst. So on the outside, Larry, what's going on here?
There's a brawl underway. There's a big fight. So when I first got into the CIA and we first held clearances and started seeing classified information, I quickly discovered that when you've got a policy issue that everybody agrees on, there are never any leaks. It's kept close, tight. The leaks come when there is fighting between people with different points of view about what's going on. And so when you see, and so this leak out of State Department is significant as well, because that is so damning in terms of the corruption argument, because it feeds into what many Republicans have been arguing, that there is no financial controls over the aid that's being sent to Ukraine. And it's being siphoned off. I mean, 60 Minutes reported on that a year ago, and then took down the report or edited it out to make sure they could cover that up. So when you see these kinds of leaks, it's a sign that the unity that was once there in the U.S. government no longer exists, and it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better.
Fascinating, fascinating. Larry Johnson, always great to see you. Encourage everyone to read. Can you tell everyone your website and where people can go to read more about your daily coverage?
Sure. My primary